The middle housing code changes have to be adopted and effective not later than June 30th, 2022, or if we don't make that deadline, then the model code will apply directly to the development of middle housing in Eugene until we've adopted code changes and, if necessary, comprehensive plan changes to comply with House Bill 2001. There is a possibility of an extension of that timeline for areas with significant infrastructure deficiencies. You might have heard this referred to as the IBTR, infrastructure-based time extension request process. And the infrastructure that the rules are looking at is water, wastewater, stormwater, and or transportation. But those deficiencies do have to be pretty significant. There's an application process that a city would need to go through with DLCD to receive a time extension. And part of that is discussing how those deficiencies will be remedied and how that will be paid for. So that's all kind of, it's not a get out of jail free card. That's all part of it. And at this point, I know that public works staff is involved in discussions. We're looking at Eugene's infrastructure, but my understanding is at this point, we're not aware of any significant infrastructure deficiencies that would require an IBTR, a time extension request. So there's no plan to submit one currently. I see Commissioner Taylor has her hand up.
Thank you, Lauren. I just have a quick question just for confirmation. Is that I'm assuming with code changes, the comp plan is being looked at as well as the TSP for compatibility with any code changes that would occur. And those two documents would be updated within that same timeline to meet the deadline?
Commissioner Taylor, the comprehensive plan is being looked at. One of the things that House Bill 2001 exempted cities from is compliance with the transportation planning rule for these middle housing types. So we don't have to worry about TSP, TPR compliance for this particular code update, but we are looking at the comprehensive plan and trying to decide whether that would need to be updated as well, especially when it comes to some of the prohibitions on maximum density that we'll talk about in just a minute. Yeah, thank you, Terry. So, and then we already talked about this. If we miss the deadline, then the model code will apply directly until our code is updated to comply with 2001. Next slide. Okay, so now.
Quick, Lauren, that slide said 2020. It was supposed to be 2022, right?
Yes, correct. Yes. Thank you.
Perfect.
Sorry, Commissioner Dillon. Yes, 2022. That's an important distinction. Okay, so getting into standards, these slides are not that exciting, but I use the slides to highlight the high-level types of standards that we're talking about, and then I will go through and talk you through the standards. If you'd like to refer to the tables in attachment A to your AIS, there's a lot more information in those tables. So starting with duplexes, in terms of approval process, the city has to apply the same approval process to duplexes as it would apply to detached single-family dwellings. In Eugene, construction of a detached single-family dwelling in R1 is typically allowed by right or is outright permitted, and so it only requires a building permit. So therefore, a duplex would be the same, would only require a building permit. In terms of numerical standards, the rules say the city is not required to allow more than 2 dwelling units on a duplex lot or parcel. So a duplex is not entitled to an ADU because that would be 3 units, but the city could decide to allow that if that's something that we wanted to do. Turning to siting standards for duplexes, a lot of them just harken back to detached single family. So the minimum lot size for duplexes cannot be greater than the minimum lot size for detached single family in the same zone. In Eugene, typically in R1, minimum lot size for detached single family is 4,500 square feet. So that is what we would expect to see for duplexes as well. In terms of density, the city cannot apply density maximums to duplexes. So we just don't look at a maximum density. Setbacks cannot be greater than the setbacks applicable to detached single family in the same zone. So again, in R1, typically front yard setbacks for detached single family are 10 feet and interior setbacks are 5. Height, maximum height for duplexes can't be lower than maximum height standards for detached single family. And again, typically in R1, the height for detached single family is 30 feet. So that same height limit would apply to duplexes. Commissioner Taylor, I see you have your hand up.
I'm sorry, I just have a quick question. So when the city can't apply density maximum to the development of duplexes, does that mean that if in R1 the maximum is 14 units, that 14 units can't be applied when developing duplex? Explain that to me. I guess I'm...
Yeah, I think so. I mean, again, so the rules are written, as a caveat, the rules are written for all large cities in the state of Oregon and don't take into account kind of how specific code language is written. But my interpretation of that requirement is, yes, exactly what you said. If a duplex were developed in R1 in such a way that it would exceed 14 units per acre of density, we couldn't say no just because it exceeded the density maximum.
So for instance, if there was a subdivision with 14 units and each of the 14 lots, each of the lots had a duplex, you have double the amount of the 14, you couldn't regulate it because the duplexes are on each of those lots. So you'd have 28, something like that.
I think that's right.
Okay, thank you.
Parking standards for duplexes. City cannot require more than 2 off-street parking spaces per duplex. And for, I think, almost all of these types, the rules talk about the city may, but is not required to allow on-street parking credits to satisfy those off-street parking requirements. So if there's, the developer can show that there's substantial on-street parking, they could receive a credit for 1 or 2 of those spaces and not have to develop as much of the off-street parking. Lot coverage floor area ratio, the city's not required to apply it, but if we choose to, then the cumulative lot coverage or FAR cannot be less than it would be for a detached single family home in the same zone. In Eugene, we typically don't apply FAR to residential. We usually use lot coverage. And as Jeff said, typically in R1, the maximum lot coverage for a single family detached home is 50%. So it would be the same for a duplex. And then design standards. Again, if we choose to apply design standards to a new duplex, they have to be the same that would be applied to a detached single family dwelling. And the city may not apply design standards to duplexes created through conversion of an existing single family dwelling. Commissioner Edwards.
Quick question. So the 50% lot coverage, are you saying that a single detached house on a lot can not occupy more than 50% of the total land? I'm not sure. Are there exceptions to that? Because I know of like a lot of structures. My neighborhood is one of them where they're pretty tight on all 4 sides, and I can't imagine that they are only taking up 50% of the lot. So I'm just curious about that.
Through the PUD, planned unit development process, and other specific options within the code, you can go over the 50% rule. And also okay. It's a pretty strict interpretation of 50% where it doesn't account for things like decks or eaves. It's literally the building or structure footprint. So it actually is much narrower than it might appear. So there are options to get above that.
Okay, so if there's a PUD, okay, because yeah, there's just no way. Okay, thank you.
Commissioner Fragola.
Thank you. So I am curious about, as we think to implement our climate action goals as well and decrease reliance upon automobiles, would we be allowed in major corridors where we're attempting to have strong transportation support? Would we be allowed to consider decreased requirements for parking spaces?
Yes, Commissioner Fragola. We could limit it to transportation or transit corridors, or it could happen anywhere. This is a maximum number of off-street parking spaces that we're allowed to require, but we could certainly require fewer than the maximum. And a builder could build more than the maximum, but we can't require them to build more.
Commissioner Taylor.
Thanks. Actually, this is probably more of a question for Terry and Jeff. Is Commissioner Fragola's question is a good one, which I kind of have at the back of my mind, and since it's been asked, I'm just going to go for it. Is obviously there's some scope creep that could happen, right? And I'm just wondering, in terms of not necessarily scope creep, but it's just there's a lot of comprehensive elements that can be attached to encouraging housing. For instance, we have downtown exempt corridors. So now we have new exempt corridors. So essentially the analysis of how we more proactively, like the consultant said, allow, encourage, and incentivize. I think those were the three. So I'm just curious, at this point, is the charge for Planning Commission, are we still in a place of kind of brainstorming what this scope is, or does staff or legal counsel, do you have kind of a, that we want to, is there a limit? Yeah. And that might be too big of a question to answer right now, but I'm just curious what the approach is.
I think it's a great question because we talked about this in preparing for today's meeting with the goal of today. The goal of today is to focus on explaining the rules. And so this really is the allow option that we're going through here. But you're absolutely right. And that's what we're working on putting out for survey and other public outreach is questions around what if we wanted to encourage, what if we wanted to incentivize. And so the public outreach period of February and on into the following months will get at those issues. And we are hopeful that after those meetings, your next meeting in March will be when we start bringing some staff recommendations based on what we've heard from the public and everything that you've been discussing. So I think for today, brainstorming is great, asking questions about how can we do this, that, or the other, but our goal is to really give you a solid foundation of understanding what the rules require and what the model code requires. Does that make sense? Okay, thanks.
And I think part of the idea, thank you, Terry, part of the idea is that then we don't spend a lot of time as we go forward doing things that just aren't going to be allowed. So we have this sort of basis of what are we actually required to do? And so beginning to brainstorm about solutions then beyond that and asking questions about is very appropriate today.
Okay, I think we're ready to move to triplex standards, Terry, if you'll move us on slide-wise. So very similar slide to the duplex slide. They get a little boring here in the middle, sorry. So again, approval process for triplexes, same as that for single family detached, which means building permit. Numerical standards, the city may, but is not required to allow more than 4 dwelling units on a lot or parcel, including any accessory dwelling units. Minimum lot size is based on detached single family lot size. So if the minimum lot size in the zone for detached single family is 5,000 square feet or less, and in Eugene it's typically 4,500 square feet, then the minimum lot or parcel size for a triplex may not exceed 5,000 square feet. So you could have minimum lot size for a triplex be the same as single family at 4,500. You could have it be 5,000 square feet, but it cannot be greater than 5,000 square feet. City may not apply density maximums to triplexes. Setbacks may not be greater than those applicable to detached single family, which we talked about are typically 10 in the front yard and 5 in the interior. Maximum height for triplexes may not be lower than that for detached single family or 25 feet. But in our case, detached single family is typically 30 feet. So I would expect that triplex would also be 30 feet. Parking is based on the size of the lot for triplexes. So if the lot is less than 3,000 square feet, the city may not require more than 1 off-street space. If the lot is between 3,000 and 4,999 square feet, the city is limited to 2 off-street spaces. And if it's greater than 5,000 square feet, then we can require up to 3.
Commissioner Edwards.
I'm slightly confused about if the parcel is less than 3,000 square feet, because I thought our minimum lot size is 4,500.
For single family,
Yes.
it currently is 4,500 square feet. The city could decide to say triplexes are allowed on 2,000 square foot lots. And if we did that, then those lots, we could only require 1 off-street space for. If we said all triplexes have to be on 5,000 square foot lots, we could require up to 3 off-street spaces. And if we said same as single family at 4,500 square feet, then it would be 2 off-street spaces.
And so then just follow up real quick then, Lauren, would that be part of this process that we be reassigning the minimum lot sizes to, you know, to allow for something on 3,000 square feet? Would that be part of this process, or is that another process that would have to cover that?
I think it would be part of this process.
Okay.
Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you.
Lot coverage, floor area ratios, same thing. We apply generally lot coverage to residential, and the maximum lot coverage for detached single family is 50%. So would expect that for triplexes as well.
Commissioner Taylor, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to reiterate what you just said, Lauren. I think you said it really, really well. And Terry, to Commissioner Edwards and the public listening, is that really you're talking about bumper guards right now. So essentially you're saying the model code, the regulation for triplex can't go beyond 5,000. And it has the ability to have 2,000, and these are the parking requirements that are allowed by regulation per the House Bill 2001. So I think these are the important, Commissioner Edwards and Commissioner Fragola, I think these are the parts that we're listening to now, is where is there opportunity within these regulations that we can potentially consider the encourage or incentivize. So yeah, right? Did I get that right, Lauren?
Yes.
Commissioner Beeson.
Yeah, I want to try that a little differently, and maybe I'm not right. I'm thinking of this as I went through all the material. I went through the AIS and the chart you had in there that showed everything for the various middle housing types. And as we go through these slides, one thing that we're doing is, Commissioner Taylor called it bumper guards. I mean, I think one thing we're doing is getting clear on what the minimum standards are from the state that Eugene needs to comply with when we implement or allow development of middle housing. And the way my brain works, not that everyone should go like this, but I find myself wanting to get clear all the way through on what the minimum requirements are that we have to do. And then we would go back, or we would, as we progress from there, we would begin to identify areas where we might supplement we might become more flexible, and so on. And that's going to take a lot of discussion in all these various areas too, all with the goal of possibly allowing more middle housing than what the minimum would require. Am I kind of on track there?
I think you're exactly on track, Commissioner Beeson. I think you can think about it in both the way that you have described and the way that Commissioner Taylor described. We call them minimum standards, but it gets a little confusing because it truly is writ large the minimum that the city is required to do to comply with the bill. But some of the minimum standards are maximums, so we cannot require more than X. Right. And some of them are minimums. We have to require at least as much as X. And then as Commissioner Edwards' question kind of illuminated, there's a lot of interplay between the various standards. So we have can't require a maximum lot size that's greater than 5,000 square feet. Okay. Then depending on what the actual size of a particular lot is, there are specific parking regulations associated with that lot and maximums associated with those. So it does get complicated. So
just a very quick follow-up. As I get into this and learn about it, these minimum standards or whatever it is that we're going to call them, I find I've been looking at the middle housing code that I know we're going to talk about, and there's also the Division 46 middle housing, I guess it's the OAR rules that we have. I'm trying to just maybe a short answer of where do these standards, they reside in these documents?
Yes.
Minimums?
Yes. So what I am talking to you about right now is what is in Division 46 of the OARs. And there have been kind of colloquially referred to as the minimum standards. Okay. Then separately, we have the model code. And that's what Kate and Matt will be talking to you about in just a few minutes. If Eugene doesn't adopt its own standards, then the model code would apply directly. But some of the minimum standards that I'm talking to you about reference the model code. So we're either sort of required to pull in pieces of the model code, or we might choose to pull in pieces of the model code to satisfy some of the minimum standards because the model code satisfies the minimum standards. So
I need to kind of keep all those documents handy.
Yes.
All right. Thanks.
Commissioner Isaacson.
Thank you. Back to the forecasting. So if some of these requirements are going to be a little bit woodgy, they go back and they can change it and allow for increased density that's not part of the plan right now, that's going to obviously drastically change whatever forecasting we're coming up with. So is the forecasting that's going to be coming out going to wait until those rules are set and final, or are we going to have a forecast that then can be amended once the final rules are agreed upon by council?
Commissioner Isaacson, I'm happy to take that really briefly and just say that that analysis is going to be based on the typical R1 standards, aka the lots that are most likely to be impacted by this. Because, like we said earlier, like the higher density lots already allow these things, technically speaking. So it's unlikely that the analysis will necessarily need to be redone since it was based on the model code requirements, therefore the minimum. In the event that we do go way towards the incentivized, we may have to look a little further at those, but right now we're not anticipating having to do that.
I'd like to add a little bit to that because part of your question touches on how do we anticipate and plan for the future. And this is fundamentally changing how we deal with density. And so it will impact how we do our next buildable land inventory and how we account for our housing need into the future. And that we can't start calibrating until we have adopted code, but it will be significantly different than the way we've done it in the past.
Commissioner Borowski.
Thank you. When discussing siting standards in regards to triplexes, quads, and the higher intensity uses, there is an allocation that you can, or that it must be allowed on 75% of a census tract. I'm just wondering where that fits in. How do you, if the city decides to, that, yes, we want to put some sort of a cap on this, and I'm not advocating for putting a cap everywhere, but I do feel that there's going to be, especially when we get the Eco Northwest analysis, there's going to be areas of this city that are more impacted or more developed, let's say. And we're gonna, I think that's what we're gonna hear from some of the neighbors, you know. So there is an ability to say, okay, we're gonna allow duplexes can go everywhere, but triplexes, quadplexes, cottage clusters, and row houses, there is some sort of a 75% census tract. Can you talk to me a little bit about that and how staff is looking at that going forward?
Sure, Commissioner Borowski. So that is a piece that we'll get to later in the PowerPoint, but I'm happy to talk about it now as well. The rules allow for alternative minimum lot size or maximum density standards under certain conditions. So DLCD was trying to incorporate a little bit of flexibility for cities to do something a little different than kind of the flat minimum standard that they thought was appropriate. And the pieces that you're referring to, you know, the various middle housing types on percentages of lots or parcels, and then looking at census tracts, apply to if Eugene wanted to adopt a minimum lot size or maximum density standard that is different than the ones that we've been talking about in the rules, we would have to go through and make a bunch of findings to show that despite these alternate standards, middle housing is still being allowed kind of throughout the city. And it is allowed on, you know, it says triplexes must be allowed on 80% of lots or parcels, quads on 70%, townhouses on 60%, cottage clusters on 70%. And then also there's a separate finding about how those kind of fill out various census tracts within the city. So it's a little bit of flexibility. There's a lot of extra kind of findings that go into that analysis. And then DLCD still has to give it the thumbs up at the end of the day. So that extra analysis only applies if the city wants to do something different than the minimum lot size or maximum density standards that are already in the rules.
So one just quick follow-up question on that. Would that be a tool that we could use to help encourage density in the areas that we've been talking about through Envision Eugene, along our transit corridors and those types of places where for the last 8 to 10 years, we've been saying, this is where we want to densify. Is that a tool that we might be able to use to help encourage density and this type of housing, let's say a quarter of a mile from a transit corridor?
Can I take a stab at that, Lauren, and we can tag team a little bit? Because I understand it to be the opposite, actually. I think the performance metric approach that you're talking about is a way for some cities to try to exclude lots from providing middle housing. And aside from that, we are still able to encourage near transit corridors, but we have to do one or the other broadly across the city, either meet those minimum standards or go through the analysis that would be required to make a case to exclude certain ones. And our thought after reading through that is that, and we talked about this with our consultant team, is that it wouldn't get us someplace significantly different than the minimum standards. The percentages are very high. And so that's our working understanding of that option.
Thank you.
Agree, Lauren?
Yep, I agree. Thanks, Terry.
Hey, Carrie, I want to do a time check here just quickly. I'm presuming you're watching the time. That's all I want to say. So
I am. I think we should be good as long as we finish up Lauren's piece within about 15 minutes.
15. Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah.
Perfect.
Great. Okay. Quickly turning to design standards for triplexes. It's a little bit different. You'll recall duplexes was basically same design standard as detached single family. For triplexes, the city has some choices. You can just use the design standards for triplexes in the model code. So here, Commissioner Beeson is one of those places where we can just look right to the model code and pull something. The city could adopt its own design standards that are less restrictive than those in the model code. So can't be more restrictive, but could be less restrictive. Alternatively, the city could decide to apply the same design standards to triplexes as we do to detached single family. But there are some, as we get into the kind of higher level housing types, there are some requirements about which design standards can be scalable and which are not. So, and I'm getting a little out of my wheelhouse here, but for example, like primary entrances, we can require 4 primary entrances all facing the street for a quadplex, say. But you could still require a single primary entrance facing the street. So those types of standards can't scale, but other types of standards could, like height, bulk, etc., would scale with the larger building. And then again, we cannot apply design standards to triplexes that are created through conversion. Okay, Terry, quadplexes. Quads are very similar in, I think, almost all respects to triplexes. The approval process is the same as for detached single family. Numerical standards, we're not required to allow more than 4 dwelling units on a lot or parcel. Minimum lot size for quads, if the minimum lot size for in the zone for detached single family is less 7,000 square feet or less, and again, in Eugene, we're talking about 4,500 square feet, then the minimum lot size for a quad may not exceed 7,000 square feet. So max minimum lot size in Eugene for a quadplex would be 7,000 square feet. Density cannot be applied. Setbacks are the same as those that apply to detached single family, 10 front yard, 10 feet in the front yard, 5 feet interior yard. Height, same, not lower than the maximum height for detached single family, so 30 feet. Parking, again, depends on the size of the lot. So lot is less than 3,000 square feet. We're limited to 1 off-street parking spot between 3,000 and 499 or 4,999, 2 off-street parking spaces between 5,000 and 6,999, 3 off-street parking spaces, and then 7,000 square feet or greater, 4. Same lot coverage, floor area ratio, kind of same as detached single family. So we're looking at 50% lot coverage. And then we didn't talk about this for triplexes, but it does apply there too. There's a requirement for sufficient infrastructure for that lot. So a developer can meet with city staff ahead of time to make sure that the lot either has currently or one can be provided connections to public water and sewer systems, access to the street system, and storm drainage facilities. And then the design standards for quads are the same as triplexes. You have that choice. You can just use the design standards in the model code. We could adopt something less restrictive than the model code. We could apply single family design standards, or when I missed this in the last round as well, I'm sorry, we can apply alternative design standards, which is a whole nother alternate process, Commissioner Borowski, that I'm happy to talk about now or when we get to that slide. And I see Commissioner Borowski's hand is up.
Yeah, I just had a question regarding conversions. So let's say when you were talking about sufficient infrastructure, so if you're doing a conversion and the new wastewater standards apply, the standards that were in place back when a house was built, maybe back in the 50s, are different than the standards that are built now. Would that affect, I mean, would they have to put, if it was a conversion, would they have to put the new stormwater standards in, or would that be something that we could or couldn't adjust?
That's a great question, Commissioner Borowski. The way that sufficient infrastructure is defined, it is a connection that's capable of meeting established service levels. And I'm guessing that means current established service levels, but that's something that we can certainly follow up with Public Works staff. Okay. Oh, Commissioner Fraggle.
Thank you. So I know we've talked about this before, but can someone remind me how our multifamily housing code is going to interface with this process? I mean, will we be kind of looking at it in tandem and thinking about if we're going to apply it, if it exceeds the bumpers, do we modify it? I mean, I'm just curious. I know we've talked about it before, but I could just use a refresher.
Jeff, do you want to take
Yeah,
yours?
sure. I can take that. So right now, for any development that includes 3 or more dwellings on a single lot, it triggers the multifamily standards, which is a whole different set of standards that do go into things like building articulation, landscaping requirements, recycling and trash enclosures. It gets pretty detailed. And so that's something that we are going to have to tackle through this process, whether it means saying that those standards do not apply to middle housing types and just kind of getting out of it that way, or you could go the way of going into each standard and seeing how, if that can be applicable and consistent with the state's rules. So I hope that answered your question.
But they would have to be consistent with the state rules.
Correct. And yeah, correct.
There, Commissioner Fraggle, is for many of these middle housing types, you know, the standards harkening back to detached single family standards, not multifamily standards. So the multifamily standards wouldn't be able to apply. There might be some flexibility in terms of some of the higher middle housing types. You know, if you got to a point where there were so many units, maybe we would import some of the multifamily standards, but I guess I will just defer to Jeff and not speculate and say that that's certainly something that's going to have to be taken into consideration in the code writing.
Yeah, absolutely. None of these standards apply to single family homes, so it presents an inherent conflict with the rules. So it'll have to be addressed.
Okay, Terry, next slide, townhouses. So same approval process, has to be the same as detached single family, which means a building permit. Numerical standards for townhouses, the city has to require at least 2 attached townhouse dwellings and must allow up to 4 attached townhouse dwellings and may allow 5 or more. So there have to be at least 2 to be considered a townhouse. We have to allow a proposal of up to 4, and we could allow many more than 4 if we decided to do that. Minimum lot size, the average minimum lot size for a lot in a townhouse project cannot be greater than 1,500 square feet, but the city could adopt different minimum lot sizes for internal townhouses, external townhouses, and corner units, as long as they all average out to 1,500 square feet or less. Street frontage, if we choose to apply street frontage, then the minimum cannot exceed 20 feet. And the city is not required to allow townhouses on flag lots, although we could choose to. For density, the city has to allow either 4 times the maximum density for detached single family in the zone, or 25 units per acre, whichever is less. In Eugene, as you heard earlier, the maximum density is 14 units per acre for detached single family in R1. So 4 times that is more than 25 units per acre. So it would be 25 units per acre. Setbacks, generally same as detached single family, have to allow 0-foot side setbacks for the lot lines where the townhouses are attached, which makes sense. Height, the minimum height cannot be lower than minimum height for detached single family in the same zone. If the city requires covered or structured parking for townhouses, then the city has to allow at least 3 stories for a townhouse. The thinking is the parking will kind of be on the bottom, and then 2 living stories. If the city does not require covered or structured parking, then we could set a height limit at 2 stories. Parking may not require more than 1 off-street parking spot per townhouse unit. Bulk and scale standards cannot cumulatively or individually limit the bulk and scale of the whole project greater than that bulk and scale of a detached single family dwelling. And that is something that I feel like I don't have a great handle on what that means in practice, but I'm sure that Jeff and his team do or will by the time this is all over. And then same requirement for sufficient infrastructure, and same set of options in terms of design standards. And then moving to cottage clusters, Terry, the last type, same approval process as applied to detached single families, so building permit. This numerical standards, the city is not required to set a minimum number of units for a cottage cluster, but it can choose to. If it chooses to require a minimum, the minimum can be 3, 4, or 5 cottage cluster units. And then the city can allow, but not require, more than 5 units in a cottage cluster. It gets confusing really fast. But so you could have, we could have a set of standards that require at least 3 cottages in a cottage cluster, and or that require 5 units in a cottage cluster. We cannot require more than 5, but we certainly could allow many more than 5. And then we must allow, so cottage clusters, as you'll recall, cluster around a common courtyard. We must allow at least 8 units per common courtyard, but are not required to allow more than 8, but may allow more than 8. So minimum lot size, if the minimum lot size for detached single family in the same zone is less than 7,000 square feet, which it is in R1 in Eugene, then the minimum lot size for a cottage cluster may not be greater than 7,000 square feet. Minimum lot width, same as that for a detached single family in the same zone, which in R1 is typically 50 feet. Density, the city cannot apply maximum density to cottage clusters, but they have to meet a minimum density of at least 4 units per acre. And then setbacks may not be greater than, the perimeter setbacks may not be greater than the setbacks applicable to detached single family, so that 10-foot front yard setback, 5 feet interior setbacks. And then we cannot require more than 10 feet or the distance required by applicable building code, whichever is less, between the cottages themselves. The dwelling unit size, each dwelling unit has a maximum building footprint of less than 900 square feet. And there are some requirements about what we can do to exempt some of that for parking or garages, but generally, these are supposed to be small, 900 square feet or less. May not require more than 1 off-street parking spot per cottage. may not apply lot coverage or floor area ratio standards to cottage clusters at all. Same infrastructure requirements and same options for design standards. So there you have it. Those are the standards for the various housing types. Terry, next slide. So this is the alternative, and then there are two kind of alternative tracks that are built into the rules. One to allow cities to adopt alternative maximum density and minimum lot size standards, which we talked about already in response to Commissioner Borowski's question. And if a city wants to do something different in terms of maximum density or minimum lot size, we have to show the various housing types allowed on various percentages of lots and some other things that didn't fit well on this PowerPoint slide. Then, Terry, if you'll go to the next slide, there's another alternative process for citing or design standards. So you'll remember you had all those choices: just apply the standards from the model code, something less restrictive than the model code, same standards as detached single family, or alternative citing or design standards. And this was, I think, in response to some cities who said, look, we already have some citing and design standards that are working well for us. We're seeing development of middle housing in our city already. We want to keep rolling with those, but they're not exactly the same as the model code, or maybe in some ways they're more restrictive, but they're working. We can show that middle housing is being developed. So DLCD said, okay, if you want to do alternative citing or design standards, we're going to give you a pathway to do that, but you're going to have to make a bunch of findings about how the standards that you're proposing don't cause unreasonable cost and delay. And we're going to compare those findings to the standards that you would otherwise be adopting under the model code or something else. So, and here are all the things that you have to look at to show that your proposed alternative standards will not cause unreasonable cost and delay, including time and cost of construction, cost of land, a whole bunch of things. So it requires pretty significant findings to be able to adopt alternate citing or design standards. And I think, Terry, that might be my last slide. Whew.
It is, and we're super close to being on time. So I'll pause and see if there are any general or high-level questions for this. I've noted down a couple of follow-up questions. I'm sure Lauren has too, and that's all great. So thank you for taking the time to ask your questions. Just kind of pausing. Okay.
Commissioner Edwards?
Are you ready for me? Sorry, I'm trying to raise my hand in the thing. I just have some general questions about the distinction between units such as townhouses and apartments or cottage clusters and ADUs. I want to, I guess, I don't know if it's a question or if it is just like, I am curious to kind of really understand those, because I don't know if they are ownership opportunities that are what makes them vary, or if it's more like, I don't know. I don't see a clear distinction between what would be an ADU and what would be a cottage. And so I know a cottage cluster would be obviously a cluster of them, but I get, I'm just kind of curious as we move forward. It is something that I would want to try to make sure that we're really clear on, because I would hate to see us get into situations where people are trying to build something, and because of this like very specific criteria that qualifies it as an ADU, that suddenly it can't be more than a certain height or something like. Does that make sense?
Yeah, Commissioner Edwards, I think you hit a couple of really important high point decision points, and Matt and Kate may have some things to say about them as well. But so one piece that you highlighted is ownership opportunities and how that affects the various housing types. Townhouses are specifically designed for ownership. They're on small lots, so you own the townhouse and the underlying real property. For most of the other housing types, as House Bill 2001 was drafted, there's no opportunity to own the unit and the underlying real property. It's all in one lot. So they will probably default to be rentals for the most part, although there is a process to go through to create condominiums where you own the unit, and then there's an association that owns the underlying real property and any kind of pieces of the building that everyone takes advantage of. Like if it's an attached quadplex, everybody's using the same roof, say. There's Eugene currently has a process for dividing duplexes. So that is something that could continue on into the Middle Housing Code amendments, so that each half of the duplex becomes its own unit on its own lot. And then there's a bill in the legislature this session that would provide for land division for all the middle housing types. So theoretically, any of them could be divided so that someone could own the individual unit and the underlying real property. And that becomes kind of differently complicated depending on whether those units are attached or detached, which is kind of another question that your comments brought up, which is, you know, if Eugene decided to allow middle housing types as detached, you know, what is the difference between a detached quadplex and a 4-unit cottage cluster, or a detached duplex and a single family home and an ADU? Or, you know, there are a lot of kind of cross pollinations that can happen there. And so one of the things that was discussed a lot during rulemaking, and our staff have discussed as well, is this idea of, you know, we identify housing types and set standards for those types, and then a developer who wants to build 4 units on a lot has to declare at the outset that this is a cottage cluster development or is a detached quadplex,
Right.
and would comply with those, and they get to decide, you know, what it is. But once they kind of pick a lane, then they comply with those standards for that type.
Okay, that's super helpful, because I definitely, I want to be able to make that distinction so that it's very clear and objective as people embark in this process. And I will just say that I also really support ownership opportunities, because I think that's a big piece of why this was a necessary step in land use, was the fact that we can allow for more people to enter into an ownership opportunity at a lower price point. So I do recognize that is one of the objectives of this legislation. So I'm supportive of that. So thank you, Lauren. Appreciate it.
Okay, Commissioner Borowski.
Sorry, Commissioner Rainey. I just want to interrupt and say now we are behind, and I want to make sure that we give Matt and Kate a chance to do their presentation. So I would suggest that we let them do it and then bunch all the questions after they're done. Does that work? Okay, awesome. And we're going to go on to the next one, and take it away, Matt.
All right. Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me. I will, as I go through here, I'll try not to repeat too much of what Lauren has said. I will have some slides where I kind of compare the model code to the rules. So I'll try to not repeat the stuff about the rules in most of those places. So, and some of this Lauren talked about already, kind of how the model code works in conjunction with the OARs. I'd say generally the model code is intended to be essentially a safe harbor. A lot of the standards in the model code were evaluated in terms of financial feasibility of development. And so they're sort of in place so that cities can apply the model code, or it can be applied to cities. And there's some good evidence that those development types will be feasible from a development or financial feasibility perspective. So Lauren already kind of talked about the alternative design standards under the 3rd bullet here, that if the city wants to do something different, it needs to demonstrate it doesn't cause unreasonable cost or delay. She listed all of those different things you have to look at. I would say for some alternative design standards, those findings are probably going to be pretty easy to make. For others, not so much. And I'll maybe give you a couple of examples as I go through and talk about some of this. And Lauren already talked about kind of when the model code applies. A city can choose to apply selected standards from the model code or the whole thing. If the city doesn't adopt standards in compliance with the rules, the model code is applied to them. If some of the standards they adopt are not consistent or in compliance with the model code, then portions of the model code would be applied to the city to those housing types where you are not being consistent or in compliance. So next one. So duplexes, really the model code standards for duplexes are largely the same as the rules or the minimum compliance standards. There's a few differences, which I will mention here. So in terms of the single, essentially cities need to apply the same standards as apply to single family. Detached standards, the OAR says you can apply less restrictive standards. The model code just says you're applying the same standards. In terms of attached versus detached units, the rules say you must allow attached and you have the option of allowing detached units. And the model code basically says you can do, either one. Off-street parking, the OAR, as Lauren said, you can require up to 2 off-street parking spaces per duplex. You can allow for more, but you cannot require more than 2. The model code says you can't allow any, or you can't require any. You can allow however many, but you can't require, you can require 0. So that's a pretty big difference, I'd say, between the two for that one. Next one. So I'll talk about kind of triplex and fourplex or quadplex standards. Kind of a similar approach here in terms of attached versus detached units for the model code versus the rules. Again, you've kind of got the option to some degree in either case, but according to the rule, you have to allow attached units as triplexes or quadplexes, and you can allow detached units. Minimum lot size, Lauren already talked about what those requirements are with the rules. In terms of the model code, you basically providing for allowing the same minimum lot size as the single family detached in the same zone. And then scale and bulk in the model code essentially uses floor area ratio to control scale or bulk, and that overrides whatever you use in terms of lot coverage. So instead of lot coverage, you would use floor area ratio, and the maximum floor area ratio varies by lot size, varies by the base zone minimum lot size. So essentially, if you've got a smaller base zone minimum lot size, you get a higher floor area ratio. You get essentially kind of more floor area per the size of the lot compared to where you have a larger minimum lot size. And that's kind of confusing, but that's the way that works. In terms of parking, that also somewhat similar to the rule, varies by lot size, but it varies by the base minimum lot size, base zone minimum lot size, as opposed to the actual lot size. And essentially for zones where you have a smaller base zone minimum lot size, you cannot require as much off-street parking as in zones where you have a larger minimum lot size in your base zone. And in the rule, you've got the option to apply an on-street credit to meet a portion of the off-street parking requirement. In the model code, essentially, it says you shall allow for an off-street parking requirement under certain conditions. So you'd have to have enough space to park a car, that you'd have to allow parking on that side of the street. So there's a number of conditions, but if the location meets those conditions, then you would essentially need to allow the off-street parking requirement, or the on-street credit to meet the off-street requirement. Sorry about that. I'm trying to talk too fast, so apologies for that. All right. And do raise your hands, interrupt me if you have questions. Otherwise, I'm gonna just keep plowing through. And I should have mentioned, I'm gonna cover duplexes, triplexes, and quadplexes. And then Kate is going to cover townhomes and cottage clusters. So the model code design standards, essentially there are sort of several categories of, I would call them pretty basic or limited design standards within the model code that apply to triplexes and quadplexes. Some similar standards for townhomes as well. So one is entry orientation, so flexible standard, you get some options. You either need to have, and this isn't all entries to the triplex or the quadplex, but at least one entry. Either it needs to face the street, needs to be at a 45-degree angle from the street, open onto a porch that faces the street, or face a common open space. And it needs to be within a certain distance also of the front facade of the house if it's not facing the street. So that's kind of how entryways are treated. Again, that applies to the units that are facing the street. It wouldn't apply to the units that are behind that unit. So, and it's really just, you got to have at least one entrance that does that. All right. Windows, this is pretty standard. Basically a minimum of 15% of the street facing facade of a triplex or quadplex needs to be windows and doors, essentially. If you've got, you know, a triplex or a quadplex, let's say it's 3 detached units and 2 of those are behind the unit that faces the street, then those units don't have the same 15% requirement. It really just applies to the facade that's facing the street. So next one, garages and off-street parking areas. So I'll actually start with the second bullet here. The intent here is to promote kind of a pedestrian-friendly environment by kind of limiting how much of the frontage is devoted to driveways and or off-street parking. So it essentially limits the total width of the driveway approach to and the off-street parking area to 50% of the street frontage. So essentially in this little diagram here, if you add up all the A's and divide it by the total width of the lot, it can't be more than 50%. So that's how that one works. Next one, kind of the last one was for actually off-street parking. This is for driveway approaches, and it works in a somewhat similar way, although the limit is by width in feet. So here we're showing on the diagram to the left, we've got a 4-unit attached, it's like a quadplex. And if you add up the width of all the driveway approaches, you can't exceed 32 feet. So you're basically saying you get 8 feet per, or you could have, you know, 2 side-by-side driveways or, you know, 2 of those pairs, and they could each be 16 feet. You can vary it, but you can't go greater than 32 feet in terms of that total width. And it's the same kind of ideas with the off-street parking. You're just trying to limit the number of curb cuts, and you're trying to limit the impact of that on pedestrians as they're walking through a neighborhood. So that's all for me. I'm going to just take a quick pause and see if you have questions before Kate talks about row houses and cottage clusters. Sorry to talk so fast. I'm trying to make sure I got through that, but any questions on any of those?
I think we're good to go.
Awesome.
All right, thanks, Matt. So I'm going to talk about row houses or townhouses. Eugene calls them row houses, so that's the word we used. So again, I'm going to try to quickly go through these and compare them to the OAR, the minimum compliance standards. So generally, the model code is quite a bit more flexible than the city could choose to be to meet minimum compliance. So for minimum lot size, for the rules, it says they can't be greater than 1,500 square feet on average, but the model code has no minimum. So you could have really pretty small townhouse lot sizes. The density kind of takes an interesting approach that's based on because the idea with the model code is it needs to be able to apply in any city in Oregon. So in your sort of higher density zones where you have smaller minimum lot sizes for single family, you don't necessarily need to allow 4 times the density. Say you have like a 2,500 square foot minimum lot size. You don't necessarily need to allow that to become 4 townhouse lots. But the way the kind of calculation works out ends up being kind of equivalent to the allowance for minimum compliance, which is 4 times the density for single family, or 25 units per acre, whichever is less. So, but for Eugene, it sounds like 25 units per acre, say for the R1 zone, is probably where you would land for kind of a minimum compliance approach. For minimum lot width or lot frontage, for the minimum rules, you can require up to 20 feet of public street frontage. But for the model code, there's no frontage requirement. So essentially, you could have townhouses that are, accessed from the street by a private street or by a driveway. They don't need to face the street at all, and there's no minimum lot width or minimum lot frontage. So again, pretty flexible compared to the rules. Again, no limit on the number of attached units. So you could, you're basically following the model code approach. Your limitation would be sort of your block standards or other kind of connectivity standards. And that compares to the allowance in the rules, which is you can limit them to 4 attached units or more. And then for parking, there is a requirement in the model code for 1 space per unit, but there's also that on-street credit, which the model code says you must apply the on-street credit. And then for the rules, you can't require more than 1 space per unit, and the credit is optional. Next slide. So moving on to design standards for row houses. So the entry orientation and the window requirements are essentially the same as the triplex and fourplex standards. So I think we can kind of move on to the next one. So unit definition, this is one that's unique to the row house model code. So each unit is required to have at least 1 design feature, and there's kind of a menu of options that you can choose from. So things like roof dormers, balconies, offsets of the facade, bay windows, that sort of thing. And it's a sort of a pretty limited building articulation standard. And it's just intended to break up facades of really, if you do allow a long stretch of townhouse units, meant to kind of visually break that up a little bit. All right, next slide. So driveway access and parking. The way the model code standards work is it allows driveways in the front of units rather than from behind or to the side or from an alleyway. It only allows that if you meet certain standards. So the driveways are limited in width to 12 feet. There's some other standards. I didn't list everything here. And that has to be on a local street. So it wouldn't allow this on a collector or an arterial. And basically, if you don't meet all of those standards, then your driveway access needs to be from basically to the rear of units, either through the middle of the development, or kind of to the side. If you're on a corner lot, it has to be from the side. Or if you're on an alleyway, then that access has to be from an alley. All right, next one. Okay, that's it for row houses. I guess I'll pause really quickly there just to see if there's any clarifications needed there.
We've got Commissioner Taylor and then Commissioner Borowski.
Okay.
Thank you. I just want to confirm, it seems pretty obvious, but at this stage, I just want to say it, is if a jurisdiction wants to relax the code, for instance, let's say allowing garage on front facade and off-street parking in the front yard only if a local street, adjustment review tool, for instance, to potentially allow that onto a collector would still be an allowed tool that a jurisdiction can use. It gets more flexible rather than, obviously the minimum here is being met. You're just allowing the potential through a discretionary process to have more flexibility.
Yeah, I can't speak to Eugene's process really specifically, but yes, generally your cities are able to modify the model code standards as long as they move in the direction of more flexibility. It's when you go the other way that you get into the territory of alternative design standards and you need to justify those.
Commissioner Borowski.
Yeah, I'm just looking at these driveway design standards, and I'm wondering if they don't comply with the city's access management plan as far as curb cuts. What is the, I mean, do we have to change the access management plans or say that you have to do a different type of driveway? Because the curb cuts, you can't have a curb cut every 8 feet or every 10 feet or within certain areas close to a end of a block. I'm just wondering how is that going to be addressed?
So my understanding is that I think access management standards are still acceptable. Matt, you're welcome to jump in if you know more.
I'll just say, so, you know, what this is saying is you can't have a driveway that's wider than 12 feet. It doesn't say that you have to allow the next driveway within 8 feet or 6 feet or 10 feet or whatever of that first driveway. Your access management standards would still apply. This is really just speaking to the width of the driveway, and in the case of triplexes and quadplexes, the combined width of driveways. So I think it doesn't necessarily preclude or say that you can't continue to apply your access management standards as long as there's not a conflict between them.
Thanks, Matt. And I would just add that in the model code, there is a reference to the city's local standards for arterials and collectors. So instead of trying to impose some kind of standard for those streets, it just defers to the city's standards for those.
The other piece about the model code to remember is that unless Eugene misses the adoption deadline, we're free to pick and choose and modify standards from the model code as much as we want. The question of a true conflict between the model code and access management standards would really only come up if we were forced to apply the model code directly because we missed our deadline.
Yeah, exactly.
Mr. Taylor.
So, Lauren, actually, you kind of addressed this and kind of what Kate said with the caveat that if for some reason we have a conflicting code standard that actually disallows that missing middle housing type from actually being developed within those bumper guard standards. Is that correct? So, for instance, I think it's great they left out collector and arterial. That gets more at what Commissioner Borowski was talking about. But let's say there are direct conflicts with access management that would disallow kind of those minimum or bumper guard standards to be met for townhouses, for instance. Those are the other code sections that we definitely have to look at to adjust to allow these housing types.
I think I understand what your question is, Commissioner Taylor. So yes, we need to comply with the rules. That is the minimum we need to do. And if there's something in our code that is in conflict with one of the requirements of the rules, then we would need to take care of that conflict. The model code provisions are something that are nice to have in terms of a safe harbor to know that, you know, if we adopt signing and design standards for various housing types from the model code, then we can be confident that they will not cause unreasonable cost and delay. But we're not required to import those standards. And the only time that there would be a true conflict between the model code and some of our code standards would be if we miss the deadline and it applies directly.
I want to ask an obvious question. In our analogy, we have bumpers, we have these guardrails, and then we have and that's the OAR, that's the rule. And then inside that, we have this model code. So the question is, why isn't the model code the same as the guardrails? That seems kind of goofy. And then the end of the analogy is we're allowed to move our white lines. So if the model code's the white line, we can move the white line inboards or even outboards. We just can't go beyond the guardrails. Have I got this sort of close to being right?
I think that's a fair analogy. I think I'll definitely let Matt and Kate jump in as well, because I know they've been involved in the model code since the beginning. But I think the model code was intended to serve two purposes. One was, for cities that couldn't meet the deadline, then there was something ready to go that would apply to them to allow these middle housing types. And then also for cities who either didn't have the staff or the time or the inclination to do the work to kind of iteratively update their own code, this was intended to be kind of a plug and play product that you could just pick up and go and be in compliance with the minimum standards, the minimum requirements. So, and they're not exactly the same, because I think the minimum requirements were intended to be more flexible to allow cities to have a little bit more room to kind of create the set of standards that worked best for them. But the model code is one product. So it is a little less flexible, but it is clear that the standards in it comply with the rules. Did I get that, Matt? What do you think?
Yeah, Lauren said just about everything I would have said. I think just one more bit on kind of why they're different. The model code had to be written in a way that we felt it could be applied to any city in Oregon, regardless of kind of what their existing code requirements look like. And so for us, for instance, with bulk and massing, lot coverage did not make sense as a type of standard to apply for bulk and massing. FAR did, in terms of something that could just be applied and substituted everywhere. So there are some things that differ for that reason, because of the fact that the rules, as Lauren said, allow for some more flexibility and allow for sort of looking at how your code is already structured and tailoring your standards to meet that structure, as opposed to kind of dropping something in on top of it. So there was a lot of discussions where it made sense for the model code to be different than the minimum standards or the rules.
And I would just add maybe one more piece to that, which is that I think the state's perspective was, okay, if you're going to have our model code, we're going to push it a little bit. So like for duplexes, no parking is required. So that's the state saying, hey, we don't think parking should be required for duplexes. We'll allow you to do that if you're going to adopt your own standards. But if you're going to apply our code, that's what it's going to be. So yeah, so that's why it's moving a little bit more on the sort of flexible, trying to promote feasibility of middle housing kind of side. Okay, moving on to cottage clusters, I think. So I'm realizing there's one important piece that we didn't include on this slide, which is that for the administrative rules, cities are allowed to allow cottage clusters to be on a single lot. They could be a city could require a cottage cluster to go through a subdivision to have units on individual lots with some shared property for the cottage or for the common courtyard or for shared parking areas, or a city could allow both of those paths. The model code took the kind of most straightforward approach, which is just to allow cottages on a single lot. And I think the main reason is that it would have been really challenging to write sort of clear and objective subdivision standards that it could be applied in any city in Oregon. So we decided to go with the more straightforward approach. But Eugene could decide, I'm guessing Eugene wouldn't choose to require cottages to be on individual lots, but you could allow either path. It will be more difficult for staff and for us to write the clear and objective subdivision standards, but it's possible. So I wanted to put that out there. So for minimum lot size, this really just applies to cottages on a single lot. So for the model code, it just defers to whatever the standard is for single family detached in the same zone. And then for, Lauren already mentioned this, it's for Eugene, it would be 7,000 square feet or less. You could allow cottages on smaller lots, but it could be up to 7,000 square feet. And then for minimum lot width, it can be no smaller than the minimum lot width for single family detached, but it could be less, or you could have no minimum. For cottage sizes, so the model code used an maximum average unit size of 1,400 square feet. So regardless, the 900 square foot building footprint applies, but then in addition to that, there's an average unit size. So you could have units smaller than 1,400 and units larger than 1,400, but there's an average size limit. Whereas the rules allow cities to limit each cottage size to a certain level. You could even go as low as 900 square feet total. There's nothing in the rules that says you can't do that. Or you could have no limit on the size beyond the 900 square foot footprint. But we thought that for the model code, an average unit size was appropriate because it allows more flexibility while still making sure that cottages are cottages and not just kind of regular single family homes. For the number of cottages, there's no minimum or maximum in the model code. So basically the size of a cottage cluster would be limited only by what you could fit on a lot and make it work with setbacks and the courtyard, common courtyard and things like that. And that compares to the rules, which say you can require a minimum of 3, 4, or 5 units, and you have to allow at least 8 units to share a common courtyard, which is how you sort of define a cottage cluster. Then for lot coverage or FAR, there's no limitation in the model code in either. It doesn't apply in FAR like for triplexes and fourplexes. And then the rules say that you can't apply those at all. So basically it's kind of the same. And then for parking, for the model code, if your unit, it's based on the unit size. So if your unit is 1,000 square feet or larger, there's 1 parking space required. But if it's smaller than that, then no spaces are required. And again, the on-street credit must be applied. And then like most of the other housing types, you can require 1 space per unit, but not more than that. And you can't require garages. And then again, the off-street or on-street credit is optional.
Let's see, Commissioner Borowski has a question.
Yeah, the one thing that I don't see in any of this is the size of the common courtyard, and what that needs to be. I mean, in our multifamily standards, we have minimum sizes for open spaces and those types of things. I mean, could the common courtyard be a 3x3 square of land? I didn't see it listed anywhere.
You'll actually see it on the next slide.
Yeah, that's part of the design standards, but it's a good question. So yeah, I think we can go to the next slide. Or actually the next slide. I'll just say, there you go. So in the model code, it's 150 square feet per cottage, and there's a minimum dimension of 15 feet. Yeah, so your courtyard size kind of scales up based on how many dwellings you have in your cottage cluster. Okay. All right, so maybe we'll go back. So there are some cottage orientation standards. So your cottage cluster is kind of defined by your common courtyard. So cottages are required to be kind of clustered around a courtyard. The model code says that 50% of the cottages must face the courtyard and be within 10 feet. And cottages need to abut the courtyard on 2 sides. But then the other cottages that aren't required to face the courtyard, they have to face a pedestrian path that's directly connected to the courtyard. And then cottages that are near the street are allowed to face the street rather than to face the courtyard. Okay, next slide. Oh, I think we can, if you go back 1, there are a couple more on the other slide. Yeah, thanks. So we talked about the minimum size of the courtyard. The model code talks about having a mix of landscaping, lawns, pedestrian paths, paved courtyard, could include recreational amenities, but it doesn't really define like what proportion each of those must occupy, or it doesn't have really detailed, say, landscaping standards. It does say that your impervious area is limited to 75%. So really a good portion of your courtyard could be paved, courtyard space. Okay, I think we can move on. So a lot of cottage cluster codes include allowances for a community building, which is like a shared, similar to what you might have in a multifamily development. And so that is allowed. I think it's one community building per cottage cluster is permitted, but the scale is limited by, you have to include the community building in the calculation of average unit size. So if you have a larger community building, that kind of, your units would have to be smaller to kind of make up for it. So the idea is that community buildings should be roughly the same scale as the cottages themselves. There are requirements for pedestrian access between the units and the courtyard and to parking areas and to the sidewalk. And those need to be 4 feet wide and hard surfaced. There's a window coverage requirement. For cottages that are close to the street, they would have to meet the same window requirements as single family detached. So what that means in Eugene, as far as I know, there are no window coverage requirements for single family detached, at least in the base zones. So unless the city decided to change that, there would be no window standard for cottage clusters if you follow the model code. And then there's also an allowance for an existing single family dwelling to become kind of part of a cottage cluster. So you could develop a cottage cluster as sort of an infill development with an existing home, and that home wouldn't need to meet all of the design standards that would apply to the new dwellings that are added to the lot. Okay, I think this is the last slide. So I think the idea with cottage clusters is to really encourage parking to be kind of shared in a and clustered together. It does, the model code does allow parking spaces to be assigned to individual units, but I think to promote kind of a pedestrian kind of friendly environment within the cluster, there are some design standards for parking. So there's sort of a limit to the number of spaces that can be attached within a cluster. There are landscape buffer requirements between those clustered parking areas. There's some sort of setback requirements and spacing and locational standards as well. And then for individual parking spaces, I think Lauren hit on this, that for the model code, individual attached garages up to 200 feet can be exempted from the building footprint, which essentially means that a cottage could be up to 1,100 square feet if it includes an attached garage. But anything above that would then subtract from the livable footprint space. Detached garages are limited to 400 square feet, which is essentially a two-car garage. And then garage door widths are limited to 20 feet. I think that's it. Looks like there might be at least one question.
Yes, Commissioner Taylor.
So I have a question, and I'm not sure, Kate, Matt, if you can answer this, and you don't have to answer, it doesn't have to be answered today. It's definitely high level. I'm just really curious why missing middle, or if there's any flexibility that they've taken such a literal translation of the cottage cluster. For instance, there's a lot of design that can accomplish the elements of a cottage cluster without the actual courtyard being in the center. It could be off to the side because of the context. So I'm just curious why there's such a literal, because, obviously we're moving to miss a middle for flexibility, whereas we're once again creating inflexibility around a specific design type by definition. So I'm just wondering if, for instance, the city of Eugene, can we flex how cottage cluster is being actually literally translated from a design standpoint?
So I'm going to take a first very quick shot at that. The legislation itself was actually pretty specific in defining cottage clusters. So the legislation itself said that cottage clusters are groups of cottages oriented around a common courtyard. And so that legislation said that. The legislation itself said that the footprint can be no larger than 900 square feet of the cottage. And so the legislation defined cottage clusters a little more specifically than it did other things. So that was kind of the starting point. And then again, in terms of the model code, we were really just trying to create a like reasonable sort of off the shelf set of standards that a city could use to regulate cottage clusters and kind of, let's say, not have really bad outcomes. The rules give some more flexibility on that, but the model code was intended to be this kind of off-the-shelf thing that you could apply, or any city could apply and have a reasonable set of standards.
I would just add, thank you, Matt. I totally agree with what you said. And I would just add that cottage clusters, if you think about development in, say, a greenfield setting, you could imagine a pretty large cottage cluster development. And so I think in that kind of context, some good design standards become maybe more important rather than, oh, if you're just going to squeeze in 4 or 5 units on an infill lot, there's only so many ways you can like really screw that up. But I think for a larger development, I think having some more detailed standards is appropriate. But also, as Matt said, that's just the model code. The city can choose to kind of do whatever they want and really not require much in the way of specific design standards.
Thank you guys so much. I'm going to stop sharing because we're over by a minute and I'm not sure if folks have other meetings or if our broadcast is going to get cut off. So I want to say a couple of wrap up things. First, thanks everyone for your questions, and to Matt and Kate and Lauren for presenting such detailed and really good information. We do have our survey launching on Engage Eugene this Friday, February 5th. Sophie wanted to make sure that I said that. And she's working on it really hard. So that'll be great. Your next meeting is February 9th. And we'll be back with more middle housing, not model code, more middle housing updates on March 9th. And the last thing I just want to say is that Planning Commission recruitment is starting amazingly today. I don't think the link or application link is quite up, but it is planned to be up starting today, and recruitment closes March 12th. If you have questions about that, I'm happy to try to answer them. Anything else, Lauren or Jeff, for the good of the order?
Okay, thank you so much. Terrific. Exactly what we wanted, to deep dive. Middle Housing 101. So now we have the basis. We know what we can do, where our guardrails are. Now let's start moving those white lines around and make it work for us. So until we meet again, this meeting's adjourned. Thank you all.